What if the country that has stood beside the United States for more than a century is quietly preparing for a future where America is no longer the center of its economic world? What if behind diplomatic smiles, trade meetings, and official handshakes, Canada is already building new alliances that could reshape global power? And what if one of those alliances is worth more than $70 billion? Today, we are going to look at a shift that many people are starting to notice, but very few are fully talking about. Because something interesting is happening between Canada and India. And if it continues, it could slowly change the balance of economic power in North America. But before we dive deeper into this story, take a quick second to support the channel. If you enjoy content that explains global politics and Canada's role in the world in a simple and honest way, make sure you like this video and subscribe to the channel. Here on the Maple Doctrine, we break down the biggest geopolitical shifts that could shape Canada's future, and your support really helps this channel grow. For decades, Canada and the United States have shared one of the closest economic partnerships in the world. In fact, their trade relationship is so massive that every single day, billions of dollars move across the border. Canadian oil flows south, American technology flows north, and businesses on both sides depend heavily on this connection. But even the strongest partnerships can face moments of tension, especially when global politics and new economic opportunities begin to change the game. Over the past few years, the world economy has been shifting in ways that nobody expected a decade ago. New markets are rising, new supply chains are forming, and countries are slowly looking for ways to reduce their dependence on any single partner. For Canada, this question has become increasingly important. What happens if the United States becomes less predictable economically? What happens if trade tensions, political shifts, or global conflicts suddenly disrupt the relationship that Canada has relied on for so long? These are the kinds of questions policymakers in Ottawa quietly think about. And one of the answers they are exploring might be found thousands of kilometers away in one of the fastest growing economies on Earth, India. India's economy has been expanding rapidly over the last decade. With a population of more than 1 billion people and a growing middle class, it represents one of the largest consumer markets in the world. Canadian companies see enormous potential there, from agriculture and natural resources to technology and education. At the same time, India is looking for reliable partners that can provide energy, raw materials, and stable economic cooperation. In many ways, the interests of these two countries are starting to align. Recent discussions about a potential $70 billion trade expansion between Canada and India have caught the attention of analysts around the world. While some details are still developing, the overall direction is clear. Canada wants stronger access to Indian markets, and India wants deeper partnerships with countries that can support its economic growth. This kind of cooperation could open the door to massive investments, new supply chains, and opportunities for businesses on both sides. But here is where the story becomes even more interesting. When Canada builds stronger trade relationships outside North America, it naturally raises questions about how this might affect its relationship with the United States. The reality is not necessarily about abandoning old allies, but about preparing for a more complex global economy where flexibility becomes a strategic advantage. Think about it this way. If a country relies too heavily on one partner, it becomes vulnerable to sudden political or economic shocks. Diversifying trade is like diversifying investments. The more partners you have, the more stable your position becomes. For Canada, expanding trade with India could simply be a smart way to protect its long-term economic security. At the same time, Washington is watching these developments closely. The United States has long been the dominant economic force in North America, and any shift in trade patterns naturally attracts attention. Some analysts believe that deeper Canada-India cooperation could signal the beginning of a broader trend, where middle powers like Canada start building multiple economic alliances rather than relying on a single dominant partner. This does not mean the Canada-US relationship is suddenly collapsing. Far from it. The economic ties between the two countries remain incredibly strong. But global politics rarely stay frozen forever. As new powers rise and new opportunities appear, even the most stable alliances evolve. And that brings us to the bigger question that many experts are starting to ask. Is Canada simply expanding its economic options? Or is it quietly preparing for a world where the traditional balance of power may not look the same anymore? Because if the Canada-India partnership continues to grow at the pace many economists expect, the ripple effects could be felt across global trade networks. New shipping routes, new investments, and new political dynamics could slowly begin to reshape the economic map. And in the next part of this story, we will look at something even more surprising, and why some experts believe this growing partnership could create pressure inside Washington, and how the United States might respond if Canada starts building stronger economic bridges with one of the world's fastest rising powers. As the idea of deeper cooperation between Canada and India continues to gain attention, many analysts are beginning to ask a very important question. What does this mean for the traditional economic balance in North America? For decades, the United States has been the central hub of trade in the region, with Canada and Mexico deeply connected to its economy through supply chains, manufacturing networks, and energy exports. But when a country like Canada begins expanding its economic reach toward rapidly growing markets like India, it naturally introduces a new dynamic into the global equation. To understand why this matters, we need to look at how global trade is evolving. The world today is very different from what it was 20 or 30 years ago. Back then, the global economy was largely dominated by Western powers, and most trade routes revolved around North America and Europe. But in the last 2 decades, Asia has emerged as a powerful economic center. Countries like India, China, South Korea, and several Southeast Asian nations are now playing a much bigger role in global trade. India in particular is attracting enormous attention from investors and governments around the world. With its rapidly expanding technology sector, a young workforce, and a government focused on economic growth, India is positioning itself as one of the most important economies of the 21st century. For Canada, this presents both an opportunity and a strategic decision. By strengthening economic ties with India now, Canada could place itself in a strong position for the future. Canadian industries are already seeing the possibilities. The energy sector, for example, sees India as a major long-term customer for natural resources. Agriculture companies recognize that India's massive population will require reliable food imports. Meanwhile, Canadian universities and technology firms are exploring deeper partnerships that could bring investment and innovation to both countries. But while these opportunities are exciting for Canada, they also raise complex geopolitical questions. Whenever new economic partnerships grow stronger, they inevitably influence the balance of influence between nations. Some observers in Washington are already watching Canada's outreach to India with curiosity and caution. The United States has long viewed itself as Canada's closest and most important partner, not just economically, but also strategically. However, from Canada's perspective, expanding trade relationships does not necessarily mean replacing one partner with another. Instead, it reflects a broader strategy of diversification. In a world where supply chains can be disrupted by pandemics, geopolitical tensions, or economic crises, having multiple strong trade partners can act as a safety net. Recent global events have made this lesson very clear. The pandemic revealed how fragile international supply chains can be. Industries around the world suddenly found themselves struggling to obtain basic materials, electronics, and manufacturing components. Governments quickly realized that relying too heavily on a limited number of trade partners could create serious vulnerabilities. Canada, like many other nations, has been quietly rethinking how it approaches global trade. Building stronger relationships with countries like India could help create alternative supply routes and new markets for Canadian goods. This is not about abandoning traditional partnerships, but about making sure Canada remains resilient in a rapidly changing world. At the same time, India also sees benefits in strengthening ties with Canada. India's growing economy requires enormous amounts of energy, raw materials, and advanced technology. Canada has all of these resources, from clean energy cooperation to critical minerals used in modern electronics. The two countries have many areas where their interests naturally overlap. There's also a demographic factor that adds another layer to this relationship. Canada is home to a large and vibrant Indian diaspora. This cultural and economic connection creates natural bridges between businesses, universities, and political leaders in both countries. These personal connections often help accelerate trade partnerships because trust and familiarity already exist. Still, none of this happens in isolation. Every major economic move sends signals across the global stage. If Canada and India successfully expand their trade cooperation toward the $70 billion range that some analysts are discussing, it could encourage other countries to pursue similar partnerships. This kind of shift would slowly reshape global trade networks, moving away from a system dominated by a few central powers toward a more distributed and interconnected economic world. And that possibility is exactly what makes this story so fascinating, because when middle powers like Canada start building strategic relationships with rising giants like India, the effects can ripple far beyond bilateral trade agreements. It can influence diplomatic alliances, investment flows, and even long-term geopolitical strategies. But the most interesting question might not be whether Canada and India can expand their economic cooperation. The real question is how the United States might react if this partnership grows faster than expected. Will Washington see it simply as normal global trade, or could it interpret it as a signal that Canada is slowly adjusting its strategic priorities? Because if there is one thing history teaches us about global politics, it is that economic relationships often shape political relationships as well. And in the next part of this story, we are going to explore what this evolving partnership could mean for the future of Canada's global role, how Washington might respond to these developments, and why some experts believe the next decade could redefine Canada's place in the world economy. So make sure you stay with us, because the final part of this story might change the way you look at Canada as strategy on the global stage. As this story continues to unfold, the most important question is not whether Canada will suddenly walk away from its relationship with the United States. That scenario is extremely unlikely. The economic, cultural, and political connections between the two countries are far too deep to disappear overnight. What is far more realistic, however, is a gradual evolution in how Canada positions itself in a rapidly changing global economy. For generations, Canada has benefited enormously from its partnership with the United States. The two countries share the longest peaceful border in the world, and their economies are tightly integrated through trade agreements, energy networks, and supply chains that cross the border every single day. Millions of jobs on both sides depend on this relationship. But strong partnerships do not mean countries stop exploring new opportunities elsewhere. If anything, history shows that the most successful nations are the ones that adapt early when global trends begin to shift. And right now, global power is becoming more distributed. Emerging economies are growing faster, new technologies are reshaping industries, and governments everywhere are trying to position themselves for the next phase of globalization. India is one of the countries at the center of this transformation. With its massive population, expanding technology sector, and ambitious economic reforms, India is expected by many economists to become one of the largest economies in the world within the next few decades. For Canada, building stronger trade connections with such a rapidly growing market could provide long-term stability and new opportunities for industries across the country. Think about sectors like energy, agriculture, education, and technology. Canadian energy producers could find a reliable long-term customer in India's growing industrial sector. Farmers across Canada could gain access to one of the largest food markets on Earth. Universities could expand partnerships with Indian students and research institutions. Technology companies could collaborate on innovation that benefits both economies. These opportunities are the reason policymakers in Ottawa are increasingly looking beyond traditional trade patterns. It is not about replacing one partner with another. Instead, it is about making sure Canada remains competitive in a world where economic power is no longer concentrated in just a few places. Of course, any major shift in trade relationships naturally draws attention in Washington. The United States has always been Canada's largest trading partner, and that is unlikely to change anytime soon. But as Canada builds stronger connections with countries like India, the balance of influence within global trade networks could slowly become more complex. From Washington's perspective, this might simply be viewed as normal globalization. Countries everywhere are forming new partnerships as markets expand and technology connects economies across continents. But some analysts believe the United States will still watch Canada and West's growing engagement with India very closely, especially if trade volumes continue to rise toward the levels that economists are predicting. What makes this moment interesting is that it reflects a broader pattern happening across the world. Many countries that were once heavily dependent on a single economic partner are now trying to diversify. They want multiple strong relationships so that their economies remain stable, even if global tensions or political changes disrupt one part of the system. Canada appears to be following that same logic. Strengthening ties with India could give Canadian businesses access to new markets, new investment opportunities, and new supply chains that reduce long-term risk. In a world where economic surprises have become more common, that kind of flexibility can be extremely valuable. At the same time, the success of this partnership will depend on careful diplomacy. Trade agreements take time, negotiations can be complex, and both countries will need to balance their domestic priorities with international cooperation. But if the momentum continues, the Canada-India relationship could become one of the most important economic partnerships of the coming decades. And that brings us back to the central idea of today's discussion. Canada is not abandoning its traditional allies. Instead, it may simply be preparing for a future where global influence is shared among many rising powers. In that kind of world, countries that build diverse partnerships are often the ones that remain strongest. For viewers of the Maple Doctrine, this is exactly the kind of global shift worth paying attention to. Because the decisions being made today about trade, diplomacy, and economic cooperation could shape Canada's position in the world for many years to come. The alliances that governments build now may determine where investment flows, where jobs are created, and which countries become the key partners of the next generation. Now, I'm curious to hear what you think about this situation. Do you believe Canada should expand its economic partnerships with rising economies like India? Or do you think staying closely aligned with the United States is still the best strategy for the future? Share your thoughts down in the comments because these conversations help everyone understand the bigger picture. If you found this video useful or interesting, don't forget to share it with someone who follows global politics or Canada's role in the world. And if you want more clear and simple breakdowns of the biggest geopolitical stories shaping Canada or West's future, make sure you subscribe to the Maple Doctrine and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next discussion.